Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Joyscape Therapy podcast, a community for professionals in the field of applied behavior analysis, board certified behavior analysts, speech therapists, occupational therapists, licensed family therapists, parents of children with autism, neurodivergent individuals, and in general, anyone seeking to learn more about ABA or about interacting with individuals with autism or other related diagnoses. Tune in as we dive into episodes discussing perspectives related to shaping behavior in professional and personal settings, allowing for behavioral principles related to everyday life. Our motto here is everyday behavior for everyday people. A reminder that with listening to our episodes, you can earn a CE. Listen here for the code words, then visit our website at www.joyscapetherapy.com/CEUS. You'll enter the code words and your BACB info at checkout, and then receive your certificate in 5 to 7 business days. If you love our content, please follow us on social media at Joyscape Therapy on Facebook and Instagram, where you can find fun activities to facilitate play with children, creating interactive teaching opportunities, and other relatable content. I'm your host, Marissa McKenzie, and to spice up today's conversation with me, we have Jennifer Rillamas, previously featured on episode 6 on interprofessional collaboration. Today, we have Jen back to talk with us about soft skills. So let's get into it. So 2 articles we're going to take a look into today are recommendations for detecting and addressing barriers to successful supervision by Tyra Sellers, Linda LeBlanc, and Amber Valentino. And the next article is Soft Skills, the Case for Compassionate Approaches, or How Behavior Analysis Keeps Finding Its Heart by Jessica Rohrer, Kimberly Marshall, Colleen Sucio, Mary Jane Weiss. And today's episode, our 14th episode title, will be Soft Skills, Utilizing Interpersonal Skills to Address Barriers to Relationships in the Workplace. So Jen, let's get into it. Why this topic?
Hi, Marissa. Yes, I am so excited to be back on the podcast to be talking about this topic. As somebody that is both an LMFT and BCBA, I've had lots and lots and lots of supervision, both good and bad. And I will say I did start my journey as an MFT first and then started my BCBA journey afterwards. And I will say throughout the BCBA program, I was surprised on the amount, or rather lack thereof, of really training on interpersonal skills as a BCBA. And so having that be such a heavy focus for my MFT program and then not seeing that as a BCBA, that was really surprising to me. And nowadays, I'm just so passionate about finding a way to kind of merge my 2 areas of expertise into one. So I'm really excited to talk about this today.
Yes, no, that's great. And so just to touch on it too, because I don't have any knowledge. So if you could just tell us a little bit about what your LMFT supervision process looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when you're becoming a BCBA, there's like restricted versus unrestricted hours, and there's percentages you have to hit of how many hours you get supervised and things like that. It does look a little bit differently for MFTs. We do have this idea of like direct face-to-face hours with clients that you log, and then there's also non-direct, like indirect client hours, essentially. So anything that you're doing, like report writing, consultations, things like that. But the supervision piece itself, when you are still in your graduate program, you need 1 hour of supervision for every 5 client hours. And so you are getting a lot of supervision. And so, in my internship, I was getting anywhere between 15 to 20 client hours a week, which meant I needed so much supervision, essentially. And a lot of times we also did group supervision. And so you can get one-to-one supervision. And then recently the BBS, the Board of Behavioral Sciences in California, they're allowing triadic supervision now. So 2 trainees with 1 supervisor, or there's group supervision. And so I know that exists also in, in the ABA realm. We have group versus individual supervision, but the ratio is just like so much smaller. Like you just needed so much more supervision. And because when you're working in, I would say, counseling psychology, like that's what my license is in, there's really so much work that you have to do inward first before you can really help others. And so that's one thing that I think is really different from supervision is right off the bat with MFT supervision, there's the expectation that you are going to dive a lot into your personal things first, because things that you've experienced as a clinician that you need to be aware of that may come up in the room, in the relationship with your clients, so you do kind of have to work through a lot of your own stuff before you get down to business with your clients. And so again, going into MFT supervision, there's just so much more emphasis, I think, on looking inward and really touching on more of the soft skills, because a hard skill, which I will talk about a little bit later, I feel like we focus so much more on hard skills sometimes in BCBA supervision, how to write this goal, how to conduct this assessment, which not to say those things aren't important, they absolutely are. But I think there's just so much opportunity to also look inside yourselves for supervision of what's my reinforcement history look like? What does that look like for myself as an individual, and how is that going to come up when I'm doing a session with my own clients? And so I think there's just so much more opportunity to kind of pull things from each discipline and kind of merge them together.
Oh, that is interesting. And so what did it look like when you were diving inward? So you were like kind of diving inward in your supervision sessions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, there is this really big emphasis when you first start supervision to really build relationship, and we're going to talk about that later on in this podcast today, which I'm really excited to get into. But there is just this first and foremost understanding of, hey, this first maybe couple weeks to a month of supervision, our meetings are really just going to be getting to know one another and getting to talk through, your goals, obviously, but then also just like, what's your background? What are you passionate about? What are some areas you're looking into? And again, just really coming up with a lot more of what's kind of happened in your past and who you are as a person. And there's just been a lot more opportunity there, I think, to just really dive in and get to know like the nitty gritty of who you are as a person, which can hopefully give you some insight or some foresight of what your counseling might look like, and so what areas of that you need to work through in order to be a better clinician. That was kind of,
And also, it's not uncommon that you would see your supervisor probably once a week or more. Do you think that's
correct?
Accurate?
Yeah, I would see them. Yeah, I would see them sometimes multiple times a week. There's different agencies that I worked at. And so, sometimes I only saw them once a week. Other times I saw them multiple times a week and everything. And it's a little different too, because they're not a lot of time for BCBA supervision. They'll like overlap your sessions and be there with you with the clients. And a lot of times that's not the case for MFT. The only way that can really happen is if maybe it was like a two-way mirror, and your supervisor is sitting there watching you do a live therapy session behind a two-way mirror, or if the client consents to having that session recorded and then the supervisor looks at it. So it's interesting because there's not a lot of in vivo feedback that happens for MFT supervision. A lot of time, at least in my experience, versus like, sometimes for BCBA supervision, you can have your supervisor there in a session with you with the kiddo, and they can kind of like nudge you a little bit and give you, oh, hey, how about you try this next time? Just kind of right there in the moment, giving you that feedback, giving you that support right there in the moment, versus MFT wise for me, like a lot of times the feedback just came back later, or it came from me telling them my experience and then them giving me the feedback based on what I told them. So it looks different that way too.
Okay. Wow. That was great. I think it's helpful to know too, especially since, a lot of, I mean, we might also have younger listeners who are maybe, before they've decided to go into their master's program. So also something to think about and just understand some of the differences. So even getting into, like how other disciplines go into soft skills and, exactly what we're going to kind of get into right now. And what you had mentioned before, so I think there's something to also speak to when comparing ABA to other disciplines. I agree that like effective supervision is going to be an evolving topic within our field. I strongly believe there are two factors to contribute to kind of how interpersonal skills translates into our work, because the nature of our field, we're majority ABA companies are going to be 3-tiered. So you're going to have, you know, an RBT level individual who is really implementing really complex behavioral concepts with, like we just mentioned, kind of minimal support. We have that overlap support, but the education piece, really, the majority of it comes in that 40-hour initial training for an RBT. So, you know, the nature of our field, and we are evolving, right? Like our company as Joyscape, we're a different kind of model where we have majority BCBAs or master's level students doing the one-to-one therapy. And then the second, which I think is actually probably the bigger one, is that the amount of people and the settings in which our service is provided, like the people we come in contact when, just due to the nature of like how ABA is given right now, we're given at much more hours than say like speech or OT. And we're in the home oftentimes, which I think, you know, adds more to the requirement for your repertoire as a practitioner, right? So you're really, there's just a lot of facets to it. And last night we had Dr. Heidi Willer do an internal staff kind of continued education as a guest speaker. She's a neuropsychologist at the Child Mind Institute. And it was really wonderful. One thing that resonated with me was that she touched on grit and fix versus growth mindset. And she mentioned that the unique thing about ABA providers when considering our work with clients and families is that we get to see individuals in various different settings. So with that being said, there's no other discipline like ours. And I think that it makes this topic especially, you know, it's like, yeah, we need to have solid supervision. We need to also remember that we're humans first. And like these soft skills should, like you mentioned, kind of come first and help us kind of understand like our internal workings, like why are we here? You know, like why do we want to help individuals? And also understanding that our work can be very stressful sometimes because we're not just working with a child, let's just say with autism, we might be working with, you know, parents, teachers, other OT, you know, OTs, SLPs. So it can be stressful at times, but yeah, that's a good kind of start to get into like why we chose this topic for today and why it's so essential. And you mentioned being passionate about finding ways. And I know that we talked about being excited. So I think that looking at personalities and how other behaviors interact is really fascinating, right? Like, I don't think soft skills are something someone just innately has when you step into the professional field, right? Like someone can be a very compassionate person. I think by nature, it might come easier for them to outwardly express those emotions. I know that's something I've really made effort in learning because it might be a little more guarded sometimes. That's just kind of my personal, you know, like what I've also received feedback on just in my younger years, especially my first couple of years as a BCBA. But I do believe that some individuals are able to show compassion with ease, whereas others are guarded. So I think translating to that, what we're discussing today as interpersonal communication is that we interact with so many personalities in particularly. And I want to normalize that blending or getting along well with others, especially when conflict arises, is really kind of the test of like, how do we implement these soft skills? So I know later we're going to talk about some helpful tools that we can reference within our practice that could really benefit. So yeah, how do we creatively tap into these when working with individuals we encounter? So other BCBAs, parents, RBTs, mentors, bosses, clients. A parent that has great knowledge about ABA and maybe disagrees with every recommendation that we're making, a supervisee that doesn't reciprocate well, right? Or sorry, doesn't reciprocate communication very well. And so these are all kind of underlying soft skills that are needed, but underneath both of these examples are those pieces that I think are really essential: trust, respect, communication, and how to navigate through some of these things. So let's go ahead and touch on what are soft skills.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are soft skills? I think that term gets thrown around so much. And so I'm really glad that we have an opportunity to touch on exactly what are we going to be talking about here. So it's almost easier to define them by what they're not. Essentially, they're opposite of hard skills. These are a person's knowledge or occupational skills. So us as BCBAs, a hard skill is like writing treatment objectives, running an FBA, having these like solid skills, running error correction, all of these skills that probably get really crammed into that 40-hour training that those RBTs go through, right? You get to learn those hard skills, but then what's not provided there is the soft skills, interpersonal skills, behaviors, tactics that someone uses to interact with others effectively. In the business world, they'll kind of say soft skills are the ability to just work well with others. And there are so many different types of soft skills. One main example that I think we've kind of been touching on already is communication skills, things like active listening, oral, written, nonverbal communication. I think active listening is such a big one because I think we'll say that to people and they're like, yeah, I know how to do that. I can do that. But it's like, do you really know how to actively listen to somebody? Because it's about being attentive to what is being said rather than preparing your next statement, or it's listening so intently that you're asking for clarification when needed. You are letting the person know that you're listening by summarizing what they're saying and reflecting it back to them by saying, oh, so it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is this. And then also checking in with them. Is that right? Did I get that right? Or is can you explain that differently to me? Reflecting feelings, asking continual probing questions. That is just one skill in and of itself, which could take forever to teach somebody, But we also have relationship building skills when it comes to soft skills. So things like cooperation and coordination, cultural sensitivity, conflict resolution, negotiation, which these are all skills that I feel like we, especially as BCBAs, need, because like you said, Marissa, like we interact with so many different people on a day-to-day basis. And so having these like tools in our tool belt are so helpful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And before we get too much into it, the first code word for today is cooperation. So we'll discuss kind of the crossover identified in the article by Rohrer and Sellers, since one kind of focuses more on utilizing soft skills within an aspect of working with caregivers and promoting collaboration, whereas the other focuses on feedback and supervision. So I think it stands out to me as a responsibility. I know in the Rohrer article, it states we have an obligation to the field and to their clients to ensure that the collaboration with families is evident within the treatment process. So for us today, I think what we're really focusing on is the how, right? Because yes, like you mentioned, hard skill, we need to make sure collaboration is happening and we need to demonstrate it through documentation and through our treatment, and it's like we're probably super comfortable with that. But when we get into okay, well, how do you facilitate adherence to a treatment plan? And when we mention adherence, that doesn't just mean the family following it, but the family agreeing to it, right? And I think then that goes back to the ones we keep on repeating, which we'll hear these words a lot, is that trust and the feeling that their concerns and their thoughts and their insights are being heard throughout the process, which then will lead to better outcomes. Rohrer mentions that empathy is kind of the perspective and compassion is the act, right? The act of showing. So like you mentioned in some of those active listening techniques where you're reiterating if you're understanding what they said correctly, where you're talking about, okay, how does this make you feel? Or can I get clarification on that? And utilizing kind of those open-ended questions with curiosity. And I thought it was really interesting. So results from a survey in the research conducted by Taylor et al., only 61% of caregivers reported that the BCBA asked parents if they were happy with how things were going. and they had another stat. I can't remember the exact words, but basically it was like if treatment was effective, that was very high, like over 90% what parents had reported. But it was very interesting that you had this huge dip to 61% in this portion of, asking the parent if they were happy with how things were going, and so it made me think, how often do I ask this question, and I think that that's really the point of this podcast, of these discussions, where we bring two different insights. I love having guest speakers, and especially your perspective, Jen, I think is super unique because you have your LMFT background. But yeah, I think it's important for us to continue developing into better practitioners, because relationships of any kind take work and mindfulness to maintain in a healthy manner, right? Whether that be on our personal end or our professional, but also respecting that our experiences intersect our professional, right? So really, it's so complex in that way, but if we continue to read the research and also to have these open discussions where, we really get to process some of these things, I think that's where we want to be as a field. And especially with age, just like friendships. I know for me, like, it takes mindful, effortful communication to reach out to my friends, some of them who have just had babies or, maybe have gotten married, that like, hey, yeah, it's okay. Let's set a date, a month in advance. Like,
oh my gosh, yes.
Or even just checking in like, hey girl, how are you? Like, do you need me to drop off some groceries? And, so just some of those things, like, and I think those underlying pieces of understanding relationships where we do put a lot of soft skills in come with a lot of vulnerability and trust, right? Like I know for me, again, when I'm thinking about professional aspect, Marissa, versus more personal, Marissa, I'm definitely more open and outgoing with my friends because there's trust, there's established there. So for me, I've really learned continue to practice how to implement that within my relationships for my mentors or my mentees, right? To really open that up in a very professional way, but also in a compassionate way, like we mentioned, kind of human first, individual first.
Yes, absolutely. I know. And something I want to mention too with what you were kind of saying earlier is, especially with the parent piece, I think you can't see us because we're on a podcast, but when Marissa said that statistic, my jaw dropped. I was like 61%, only 61% of people are asking if they're happy and how things are going. And I think it's because too, though, sometimes it's not our fault, because I know for me, when I was coming into the ABA profession, we're taught, hey, you probably want to pair just like your first like 2-3 sessions and then you're good to go. And I'm like, no, pairing has to happen every session. It has to happen absolutely every session. That's not to say that we're not running and embedding our programs and goals, but it's like, sometimes I have a kiddo that I only see once a week. A lot of things can happen in 1 week. So I need to like sprinkle in a little bit of pairing and a little bit of relationship building in there to make sure, hey, are we still good? Are you still comfortable with me? Can we proceed with our treatment? And the same thing with parents too, because I fully believe that every single person has the right to change their mind. You absolutely reserve the right to change your mind at any point in time. And so if last week you were cool with how we were teaching toothbrushing, but then this week you're like, oh, I'd kind of prefer not to do that. Cool. Tell me more. Let's fix this. And so it's like, I always like asking the parents, from week to week too, hey, especially if we have, weekly parent training, hey, everything we talked about last time, is that still sitting well with you? Before we kind of dive into today's stuff, just want to make sure we're still good there. Because especially with me, like I primarily work with in early intervention with littles, the parents are the ones carrying out the treatment goals when I'm not there. And so I want to make sure that they're feeling the most like happy, calm, cool, collected, and like they feel empowered to be doing these things with their kids when I'm not there. But if I show up one day and I completely ignore the fact that mom, who's usually in her business attire, is in pajamas and doesn't quite look like herself, I kind of want to check in about that. Like she could just be sick, that's fine. Or she could just be like having an off day, but it's like, maybe there's something a little deeper there that we need to like support and like help with. And so definitely like sprinkling in that relationship building still, I think every time is so important.
No, I love that. I absolutely love that. The especially the part where you said about, changing your mind. Right. And things do change, and really being kind of in tune to some of the things that are happening, even that nonverbal communication.
Good yes, point. Absolutely.
Did you want to check in or go into some strategies for setting up supervision?
Yeah, so kind of what I was just going off of there was talking about this idea of pairing, right? Of relationship building rapport, things like that. And I do think that, in ABA, again, we're taught how to pair with our kiddos, pair with our clients, primarily heavily in the first few sessions. But also, I think that can also apply to when you're setting up supervision, and you're planning your supervision agenda with your new mentee or something, is pair with them. We're taught how to do it with our kiddos. We can easily do that with our colleagues as well. And I love how there's an article, we can link it to the show notes for this podcast as well. But, they really you can break down pairing into even like objective things like proximity, praise, reflection, imitation, describing, initiation, creation. Like we can make pairing objective as well. And so there's a lot of ways that we can integrate skills that were learned to implement with our clients, but also into our supervision as well, to make sure that trust is being built in the beginning, that comfort, that like ability to rely on that supervisor, that's being set up from the beginning.
Yes. Oh, really great point. And one thing in the Roar article that was mentioned is compassion with others leads to empowerment. And this is something that I think, you know, approaching something with compassion as the act versus empathy as, you know, the perspective taking part of it is, you know, just doing those little things. I think there's something you'll discuss later from our notes, but I mentioned in there, like the little things, right? Such as noticing when mom, who usually is in business attire, might be in her pajamas, and checking in about that, right? Because we could easily kind of just brush it off and move on. And there's nothing, you know, to say that's bad or good in that particular situation. But I think it's in the practice of saying, hey, I'm just coming from a compassionate, you know, perspective and checking in, right?
Mm-hmm. A simple, how are you? How's it going
exactly.
today?
Mm-hmm. How was your day? Yeah. And really, truly actively listening to that and seeing like, oh, you know, I was a little tired, but it was all right. You know, maybe we only hear the it's all right part, right? So in the article, they also compared in the medical fields with the doctor's approach with individuals. There's a few different diagnoses, but one I remember was diabetes. And it showed that compassionate collaborative approach can lead to better outcomes. In that there were examples where patients were just reporting that they were more likely to adhere to their treatment when they felt that their doctor understood them, when they felt that the doctor showed compassion, even when they were faced with challenges of adhering to the particular treatment, sometimes whether that's, you know, taking the pills for diabetes or the insulin part or blood sugar, eating habits. So I thought that was really, you know, I always like to see research from also different disciplines. So even in the medical field, understanding how, you know, they look at compassion and what that looks like. And I can resonate with that. I take my mom to a lot of doctor's appointments, especially like every 6 months, she'll get some scans. And, you know, she's had a doctor for years. That was her oncologist. And, you know, he was good, but he wasn't my favorite just because of his approach. And so when we moved, you know, I made the hard decision. She had received care from him for years. And I made the decision to go ahead and transfer her over to a hospital, maybe that isn't as well known as the other. But for me, it was that bedside. It was that compassion to, you know, my mom has some challenges communicating as well. So it was kind of like, I felt like when we had a test result that maybe wasn't so great, I want to leave space for my mom to process that, especially when we're in the middle of the doctor's appointment, and not for, you know, minutes or hours even, but even give her some seconds to process. And so, yeah, so I can, this part about like the medical field in particular, really resonates with me, because I know that, yeah, I almost would rather take maybe a less renowned doctor to someone who's really going to show that care, you know, because I feel it as a, you know, daughter to my mother who has a lot of medical care. It really does make a difference. And so, you know, even just thinking in a broader aspect of what we're doing here in soft skills in our practice, I think this really hits home for me.
Yes, absolutely. I know we don't have a note about this in there, but I'm going to share this quickly, is that, you know, in the world of marriage and family therapy, in the world of counseling, there's this idea of common therapeutic factors. They are things that they are soft skills essentially that can translate to any treatment modality. You know, in psychotherapy, there's all these different types of modalities that you can have, but essentially across the board, you know, compassion, empathy, those are some common therapeutic factors, right? It doesn't matter what discipline of, like, maybe what kind of doctor you are. If you're a foot doctor, if you're an eye doctor, you can still have compassion and empathy, right? And so in counseling, we talked about this, about there being these common therapeutic factors across the board. And there was a study done that showed that across all of the disciplines, they tracked all these individuals who did all these different types of therapy, but the study ensured that every clinician was using the common therapeutic factors. And it showed that regardless of the modality, 71% of clients, of patients, had successful outcomes in their treatment simply because the common therapeutic factors were used. So it didn't necessarily matter like what modality was being used, but the one differentiator was that there was that strong therapeutic bond, there was that strong interpersonal connection. And so that's just one example of, like, it makes a difference. It so makes a difference in outcomes in treatment when you have that relationship, when you have that compassion and empathy.
Oh, wow. No, that's good to know. 71%.
Yeah.
Good.
It's a pretty good statistic, but yeah, I know I love that we're talking about this so much because we were talking about like strategies for setting up supervision, but I mean essentially it's really for setting up any relationship, especially in a professional setting, right? Having that pairing piece, right? Having that compassion, having that empathy. And then I think also when you're setting up a relationship, whether it be with parents, whether it be with a mentee, it's also diving into what their past experience was like. Because a lot of the parents we work with they've had other ABA providers. So, hey, tell me what that experience was like. What did you like about it? What did you not like about it? Same thing with supervision. Tell me about your past supervision experiences. Like, what did you like? What did you not like? Yeah, just what did a typical session look like for you? And how did you feel? How did you feel after it in the past? Because that'll tell you a lot about how that thing went. If you can't recall, there's some quote out there that's like, people won't always remember what you did, but they'll remember how you made them feel. And so it's so important to even ask them like, hey, if you don't even remember, but like, how did you feel after it? Did you feel empowered to like go be your best ABA like RBT self? Or did you feel like you wanted to quit? How did you feel after that experience? And so I think that it's so important to really take that time too, again, both with mentees, with parents, or even like, I'll even say that there was not a client of mine, but we had a new client at Joyscape that was going to get started with school services. And they were like, hey, the teachers, like they've had a really bad experience with other ABA providers coming into the classroom. Like that's somebody, even the teacher, if like they're saying, yeah, this ABA provider can come in. If you're able to pull that teacher aside and just be like, hey, how has this gone for you in the past with having ABA providers in the room? What's worked well for you and like what hasn't? Because I think understanding that somebody cares about their impact in your life and in your flow of things, like that makes a difference to strengthening that relationship to have more successful outcomes for the kiddo in the long run. So really making yourself vulnerable and open to asking that and asking for that feedback early on, I think it might be a little uncomfy at the beginning, but I do think that like it could pay off so much in the end.
Yes, no, definitely. And I do find like doing those things in the beginning and throughout, you set a tone, right? And that's another piece too, is like boundary setting in a healthy way, right? Like I'm setting a healthy boundary and an expectation of like, hey, I'm here to check in. And I think that speaks volumes in itself, right? Of just like, I care, I'm open to checking in frequently. You told me you went to Santa Cruz last weekend. How did that go? And like those just small pieces that I think that people can leave feeling a certain way. And it, like you mentioned, that's what they really remember, and I think that is a important aspect.
Yeah. And I think too, when you're starting out with a relationship with somebody, like you were saying, kind of setting the tone also of like, the idea that you're always open and willing to like assess the status of things, so kind of like I was saying earlier with parents, they reserve the right to change their mind. I mean, same thing with supervisees, you can ask them at the next supervision meeting, like, hey, I know we kind of talked about a heavy topic last time. How did that sit with you? Like, how are you feeling about it today? Do you need to unpack that a little bit more? Or like, is there something that you didn't get the chance to say last time that you want to say now? Like creating this dynamic of like, there's always opportunity throughout the relationship to provide feedback. It's not just every 6 months when we're doing the evaluations that are due, but it's like, how can we just have ongoing openness? And so, hopefully, ideally in supervision, you set those things up. This all sounds great and wonderful, but obviously, even with the best intentions, it's like issues in supervision can still come up, and the article that I offered for today's podcast, the recommendations for detecting and addressing barriers to successful supervision, they really talk about 3 different supervision issue areas. That's not to say that there's isn't more, but for the sake of their article, they kind of broke it down into 3 different areas. So they talked about disorganization and poor time management, poor interpersonal skills on the supervisee's end, and then also difficulty accepting and applying feedback.
I have a question. I'm wondering why they was there any like particular aspect for the supervisee's end because I think that, even as we're opening up this conversation, right, like there's also, I think pairings are super essential. And so I was wondering, like, was that specifically stated about the supervisees? Because I think that there's something to say too, is sometimes, there are those aspects from the supervisor as well. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, totally. I'm like chuckling over here. Yeah, I thought it was so interesting that they like positioned it like on the supervisees end. They do say in the beginning of the article, they do talk about like the need for supervisors to do their own reflection of like their own experiences and supervision, how they themselves can set up good supervision. But I think that they were kind of wanting to talk about like how can we help if a supervisee has poor interpersonal skills, how can we support them? But the matching part that you just mentioned, oof, I feel like we could have a whole nother podcast about that too, because it does bring up this idea of like we all have such different histories, like we could all come from different economic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, we all have different histories. And so I think the match is so important as well. And that's not to say you're going to get it right every time, but I think that's this idea of like being able to evaluate the relationship on both ends. Is this a good fit for both people? And being honest with each other if it isn't. Because we would not want that for our clients. If it was a mismatch with clients, sometimes we just need to be honest with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that was something I will admit, that was something I had a really hard time with in my MFT internship, is that, I'm right out the gate. I did get a few clients that just like weren't a good fit for me. And I took it so personally, but I really had to change my mindset around that, around this idea of like, there's not one cookie cutter approach to treatment. And like, I want the best for those people. So why not help them find, a good fit? I realize that's getting a little off topic of what you were asking about, but yeah, I think that there is a call in the article to supervisors to reflect on their own interpersonal skills and then seek further consultation and supervision on that as well, if they feel like there's a deficit on their end going into a new mentee relationship.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I know you have a lot on that third, like the difficulty accepting and applying feedback, but just to touch a little bit on that, like the second one of the poor interpersonal skills. So I think there's also things like even I'm learning to navigate of just understanding power dynamics, right? And whether I'm on the end of, I also receive mentorship outside of Joyscape. Shout out to Dr. Danielle Beal. She's wonderful. But, just really understanding those power dynamics and how it is a balancing act. I don't think that you're going to find quote unquote success in any relationship just because it always stays balanced, because I don't know that that's realistic. But what I do think is realistic is to understand those power dynamics. And when they shift, are you having open communication about that? And one thing they've mentioned in the article was about role stress. So just even stylistic differences, miscommunication due to different communication styles, right? And when conflict arises, how do we respond as practitioners? We have a great episode 10 with Cindy Dow, as we go into depth about how to kind of rise out from conflict and move forward from it with a productive and in a productive and effective manner when working with individuals professionally. So I think this is also important when we're talking about sustainability of professional relationships after conflict, right? So that kind of conflict resolution portion of moving on with treatment and being able to still see success even after you do have conflict, because I think conflict is very normal, and obviously the way we navigate, I think, is really the kind of differing places we could be at. This could continue to move forward in a healthy and effective way, or sometimes, you do have to look at maybe another clinician is a better fit, or whatever that mismatch might be. Like you mentioned, even for the difficulty in accepting and applying feedback, one question I had was just how do we differentiate, and you touched on it a little bit earlier too, but how do we differentiate between what is feedback versus just having an open discussion? I think I broke it down for you a little bit. It's just also sometimes I feel like my mentees or even supervisees in the past, as well as even now sometimes, is that I don't know that they expect me, or maybe I put too much expectation on myself, but that I should know everything, or that I do know everything, or if I don't, then I should know where to find it. So one big piece of, like, within my mentorship, I have a goal for myself is establishing a reciprocated and collaborative relationship. And I notice key points where my mentee is kind of taking the discussion as a rule versus an open discussion to make that decision together. But sometimes I see this really cool shift happen where they begin to understand that the shift in power dynamics is really shared, and I'm not just kind of driving the whole way, but it's for us to have a hand in it. And of course, it's a balancing act, but I think for me, a goal is a goal in any relationship, because I am wrong sometimes. And that's both, like I said, on the receiving end and on the giving end, if I am the supervisor or the mentor.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you're bringing this up, because I do think that something really cool that can happen in supervision is kind of from the get-go, letting your supervisee know, like, hey, there's going to be times in our meetings where, we're going to provide feedback to one another, but there's going to be also really awesome times where we get to have this co-created space together, where we get to bounce ideas off of one another. And like, that would also be a really great opportunity for the supervisor to be like, hey, I know that you have had experience in X, Y, and Z, and I'm hoping that in times you can share with me more about your experience with that, and we can work on this together. Acknowledging that while the supervisee may not have as much experience and they might still be in their master's program, they still have lived experience that is worth contributing to a conversation, which I think can really empower somebody. So like letting your mentee and creating those spaces in your supervision to be like, hey, like, let's just have like an open discussion about it. And especially, if you share cases too, if you're working with the same client, that can foster so much opportunity to be like, hey, so this was what I saw the other day, and this was kind of my perspective. Like, what do you think? To really let them know, just because your perspective, maybe you think the function of this behavior is X, and then what does the mentee think the function is? And like really understanding, like, this isn't necessarily a teaching opportunity where I'm telling you you're wrong and I'm right. We're literally collaborating on this together. And so I think creating opportunities like that, because yeah, you can totally be wrong about things. And I think there's so much power and grace in being able to say to a supervisee, like, I don't know, but I'm going to help you find out, or I'm going to we're going to work on this together and like get the answer for you. Because yeah, I think there's so much strength in being able to teach somebody those critical thinking skills, those problem solving skills, which again, don't always get touched on in master's programs. And so I think really being able to facilitate that type of learning in the mentor relationship is really cool.
Yes. And improving compassionate, collaborative approaches in behavior analysis. So within the Rohr article, they provide a tool, it's a compassionate collaboration tool, and it has various different questions. And really their goal here was to improve procedural fidelity and also to facilitate self-evaluation from practitioners. So this this tool has on a rating scale, a 3-point rating scale with various different questions, some varying like, did the clinician incorporate family or individual client input when identifying objectives? Did they use a vocabulary that matched the family or individual's repertoire? Did they use do instead of do not statements? So, those are just some examples, and we'll link the article as well because it's included within there. But yeah, just kind of, it's nice to be able to not just disseminate this information, have an open conversation about it, but to actually have some permanent product that we can implement within our practice and utilize. Like, for example, right now I'm doing 2 assessments within this month, and, really keeping myself kind of accountable is really using these, both of them, the one you'll introduce as well, Jen, tools to help guide me, right? Because I might forget, right? Because it doesn't come so naturally. It is helpful to say, oh, let me reference this really quickly. Did I ask those open-ended questions? Did I check in about how it made them feel? So just some of those things that I think are really cool to have. So we'll definitely link these in the show notes for you guys to reference. But I'll let you go into the feedback portion, Jen.
Yeah, so like I was mentioning earlier from this article, the last of the 3 issues in supervision that they mentioned was difficulty accepting and applying feedback. And I think that we all have been in a position where like feedback's uncomfy, and I feel like there's a lot that can be done though to help make it better. And I think it's interesting too, because feedback also happens with our clients' parents as well, with the caregivers, and sometimes we have to give teachers feedback in classrooms too, which is like super scary for me, but something that I'm really growing on and I feel like I'm getting better at. But that's why I feel like it's so important to create an environment where, like you were mentioning, there's this trust, there's this empathy, and there's a feeling of compassion, because within that relationship is where the ability, I think, to hear feedback better and receive feedback better, like that is one of the best things that you can do from the get-go to make that person open to hearing that feedback. So when we talk about feedback, feedback's just important information about performance that can help that performer improve. And in general, there's really two types of helpful feedback. So we have positive feedback and we also have constructive feedback. And I think, Marissa, you want to mention that the next code word is
constructive.
Constructive. There we go. All right. So positive feedback, specific information that confirms to the performer that he or she is doing the right thing. Constructive feedback, on the other hand, is specific information about maybe like a less desirable behavior that decreases the likelihood it will occur again, while also giving a description of a more desirable behavior to take its place. So not just saying, this is what you're doing wrong, which you should never say it like that, but the constructive feedback is going to highlight, this is what we need to fix, and here is what a better, here's what the more desirable behavior is to take its place. And so I like pointing out that using both positive and constructive feedback in the same sentence can really send mixed messages. And that can like lead to like confusion and frustration. Like, oh my gosh, you did such a great job. But like that but is going to negate everything that comes before then. So like, I know for me personally, you could like tell me how amazing I am, how wonderful I am. But the second you say but, I forget all of that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? So ideally we want to try to avoid that, the positive, but, but there are strategies of how to increase effectiveness of receiving feedback, especially constructive feedback. So like I said just then, separating positive and constructive feedback, and just saying things like, this time I'd like to see you X, Y, and Z. You can also like first give constructive feedback and then the positive feedback later. Just something along the lines of like, oh, so I noticed, in this instance, or like, I wanted to discuss with you what I saw here in X, Y, and Z, and then giving a positive follow-up after that related to it as well, because sometimes that doesn't completely negate, what was said just entirely prior. And again, you can't
infinitely pair the positive. So maybe, every time you're getting positive, you're waiting, right? It's almost creating this like delayed, anticipation that feedback,
right.
good feedback is coming after that, social praise, right? So I can see definitely why you wouldn't want to kind of, pair those two. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And, I guess you could, in theory, combine positive and constructive feedback depending on the person. I think it would be more appropriate to combine it in the way of like, hey, so I noticed you did this in this way, which might not have worked best for this learner, but you might also try this, which I've seen you do well with this learner. So it's giving them feedback that maybe this didn't work in this instance, but you've seen them use a similar skill that did work, and you just want to tell them, hey, put that in its place. So it is like highlighting a strength. It's like, oh, so remember how you did this with this person, or how you did this in this instance? I think trying that in this instance, in this other instance, would be more helpful. So it's this idea of like pulling on the mentees or the supervisee's strengths to kind of fix their own behavior. Not every mentee might have those available, but I think being able to highlight both mentees like quote unquote good and bad behavior in one can help them learn from themselves.
Yes. And what sits for me there, what you just said, is that you're pulling so like it almost would reinforce that you're watching keenly on and appreciating what I'm doing, right? So the fact that you might even reference something that I maybe did last overlap, or the last time we met with this particular client, when you bring it back and you highlight it and you say, hey, this might be better used here, to me, that makes the constructive part a little bit more, feasible, because I hear that you're coming from, hey, this is what I'm seeing in your toolbox. Let's try this here. So that's what I would take from it, is that, oh wow, you really were watching and observing, and you're helping me place something with a little bit more precision, and I think I personally would really appreciate that in an overlap, just to hear like, oh, they remembered my skill and they saw it as a strength, but they think that it would be well put here, and I'm going to try that next time. It kind of gives that uplifting that's needed, I think.
Exactly. And it's this idea of, you don't want to create this all or nothing black or white dynamic that, like, just because you did this one thing wrong means that everything you've done is terrible. Like, that's not really the case. And so, yeah, being able to pull on a person's strengths and bring that back around. I think that method could even be used, like, with caregivers. It's like, oh, hey, so remember in this instance, I saw you use this reinforcement strategy. I think this would work super great here as well. So, like, really empowering people, like I said, or letting them know that you want to build on that skill. Like, hey, so I saw that you did this time. That's awesome. Next time, let's add on this. I'd like to see how this would look like for you, or I'd like for you to try this on and see what it might look like if we added this, or something like that. So again, that idea of like building on someone's skills and repertoire already can definitely be supportive. The article 2 really mentioned these really interesting methods that I didn't really think about, was like increasing the frequency with which low stakes corrective feedback is delivered. So it gives an example of like a mentor realizes that their mentee is super open to receiving feedback on report writing skills. But, they get a little more guarded maybe when it's about like face-to-face direct skills with a client. And so what you do is you increase the frequency on that, where you're maybe giving feedback on the report writing, because that they're more open to that, to like kind of soften the blow essentially when it comes to other feedback being delivered, because you don't want it to be like this person never gets feedback and then they get constructive feedback and they're like, well, I thought I was doing everything perfectly. Which, like, I hope that we would humble ourselves to know that we're still learning. And in every instance, we always have areas for growth. But yeah, to kind of just, again, facilitate that tone throughout, like, hey, I'm going to be giving you feedback throughout this whole process. And honestly, kind of same thing with like caregivers too, essentially. And it's not that you're wanting it to do it to like punish them by any means. It's like you want to help them and you want to help them succeed. And so really finding that low stakes corrective feedback and like helping them kind of almost get desensitized to the feedback coming their way.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I also loved how they touched on like increasing active support during and after corrective experience. So, validating is a huge soft skill that I think can be used a lot. It's like, hey, I know it's difficult to hear this piece of feedback that you need to keep working on this skill, but we will tackle this together. So like reassuring the person, like validating, like, I know it's hard, it's probably hard to hear this, but like reassuring them, I'm going to help you. Or I love this idea that they mentioned too, of like sending a follow-up text or an email, like, I wrote this example like, hi, Jen, just checking in to see how things went for the rest of your day. I really appreciate your hard work in our meeting earlier today. I think, again, that piece is so, it's just so important. And like, I love that at Joyscape, I've been here for like 2 years now, and some of my clients I've had since I started, and I've built such awesome relationships with these parents, and we've gotten to the point where every now and then, they'll text me on a day that I don't have session with them, but they'll be like, they'll share like, like, hey, like this happened today. Like, this is a good success that we did. And it's like, yes, you're doing amazing. Like that little touch point and that encouragement and like knowing that you're there for that support throughout, I think is just like so amazing.
Yes. Yeah. And this was the little things that I had commented on, just that, I think as individuals, right, we do just innately maybe value being heard, right? Being, feeling like what we said was actually listened to, being cared for, and being recognized for our efforts. Even being a part of leadership, this is something I'm always kind of critiquing myself on as well, and really like observing those small things so that we can reference them and really personalize them. I think we talk a lot about praise, even social praise. We should make it specific to the learner. And same thing when we're working with others, whether that be parents, colleagues, whomever, is really also observing kind of those those little things, and how we evaluate clinical quality kind of it all brings this, right? Like all this feedback is, I'm thinking bigger picture of like, how do we evaluate some of this, the clinical quality of what we're doing, right? And of course we have documentation to show us. I could go in and look at SOAP notes, I could go in and look at assessments and reports, but that doesn't necessarily show me how someone interacts with a child. And when we do the interviews and stuff too, I get to see just a variety of different people and their styles, and I take bits and pieces too of like, oh, that's a cool trick, let me try that. But really just learning that this is difficult to do when a mentee doesn't want to be observed or overlapped, or admittedly, this isn't the most comfy thing, right? But there are tons of benefits when it's done in a trusted and respectful way. And that starts way beyond, right? Like you mentioned before, the pairing piece, and I think that for me is what I'm taking now, is like honing in on some of my leadership skills and pieces that I'm actually getting the time. I've been a supervisor before in a 3-tier company. It's very different from what I am now, right, as leadership, because I feel like I have time to really hone in on these skills, how to give feedback. And I don't always do it like right sometimes, or I will reflect and maybe be a little too harsh on myself. But I love this piece in the article where they mention conveying compassion and practicing collaboration is essential. They also pointed out that we must adhere to procedures that are conceptually systematic and empirically supported. And one of the pieces they mention in research conducted by Schreck et al. In 2016, they reviewed a survey where participants had responded to using ineffective or even harmful treatments, and that their choice to do so is influenced by parents or clients. So the emphasis here really is being on, for me, sometimes the difficulty is helping a mentee or anyone I'm supervising learn the balance between, we want to always approach things with compassion. That doesn't change. But we also should not in the process abandon, our background, our science, our ethic code, right? So I think those are pieces sometimes that we're all learning, that as we're like elevating our practitioner skills, these pieces go into it as well, where just because we're family-centered, we're coming at it with compassion, that doesn't mean we abandon or are always quote unquote agreeable. And this is where the soft skills truly come in, is when it's not those super, quote unquote easy times, right? But the practice, kind of like how you said, desensitizing yourself for those low stakes, are going to get you to that part where you're going to be able to then, when it really matters, or, it doesn't always have to be in the moment. I think sometimes we think like, oh, I got to know it on the spot. And that's not true, and I think that humility piece we talked about earlier, of also being like, I think I need to sit on this. Let me navigate it. And can we, circle back around in an email, or can we set up a different meeting so that I can maybe consult? We also have each other. I don't think we use that enough either, is to have one another as, hey, I need to speak to someone. I think we just did that on a case as well. And it's really an advantage that I think we should continue to take advantage of.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. I love that you brought that up. I wanted to mention earlier too. I'm like, you were my supervisor for a very brief period of time, a long time ago when I first came to Joyscape. Like, we worked in different regions, but I was taking a case in the other region, and so we got to work together really briefly. And I wanted to let you know that I really appreciated like, you inquired about like how I learn best. Like, you asked me, you're like, how do you learn best about like in this moment, like with this client? Do you want me to model it first, or do you want to try it and then I give you feedback? Like, you are open to kind of like figuring out which way I was going to learn best and like get feedback best. And so I appreciate that you did that for that time that we briefly shared that case, and always for being open to consultation too, like we did just recently. Yes. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, kind of going back to that feedback piece. So yeah, we talked about, some things that you can do with setting the relationship early on, embedding this idea of feedback, explicitly discussing the expectations around discussing feedback, having the supervisee engage in self-reflection. Again, like thinking back on their other previous supervisors, what worked well for them, what didn't. And then also, I like this piece too that the article mentions about equipping supervisees with alternative behaviors. Sometimes if supervisees realize in the past, like, if you get hard feedback, what have you done? Have you canceled meetings? Have you, do you sometimes get combative a little bit? It's like, hey, having adverse reactions to feedback is normal. It is a
Yeah.
normal thing because it's uncomfy. We don't like it. And so we want to engage in avoidance and escape behaviors to get away from it, right? And so how about we pull on our own like skill sets and teach replacement behaviors. Let's teach replacement behaviors for our supervisees, whether that can be taking notes, paraphrasing the feedback, thanking the supervisor for the feedback, working through together of like, hey, what are some acceptable replacement behaviors we can create together for when you're getting this feedback? Obviously, you can always role play with feedback as well. Before you actually deliver feedback, it's like, hey, like, let's try this out to see how this works for both of us. But the thing that I think we really wanted to highlight was the tool from the recommendations for detecting and addressing barriers article. They reference the CFIR, which is the corrective feedback instrument revised. This is another tool. Again, the article is going to be linked, and so you can take a look at it. It'll be in the article itself. It's a tool designed to encourage leaders and members to engage in structured conversations, focusing on the value of feedback, the importance of leaders modeling openness to feedback, and any concerns that members might have about receiving feedback. And I think, Marissa, you were kind of thinking that it's like a balancing act, yeah?
Yeah. Just like I mentioned before, I think I touched on it as a whole, but that is always the challenge. I think it's just understanding that it's not just kind of one and done, right? Or it's not cool. I use this tool, keep it, and now I have it in my box. You got to practice it, right? You got to model it sometimes. And also I even have old articles that I kind of marked. I've been trying to get more organized in that just because I read so many articles, but then I'm like, oh, where do I find it? Or I might forget about the material. So even just having a place, whether that be electronically or for me, it's in actual paper files, of where I can reference of like, oh man, I know I read that. Where did I put it? So at least having a place to go back and reference, I think is super helpful. We have the drive at Joyscape too, where we get to reference different things by topic or by different CEs. So I find that really helpful too, is it's just not a one and done type thing, but something you'll kind of have to tap into and take time to really build into your toolbox.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because this tool itself has like a supervisor and then a supervisee version. And I think that even the supervisor version, it would be helpful to maybe revisit this tool at the beginning of every supervisor relationship you start, not just feel like, well, I completed it once and I'm done. It's like, I think that continual reflection. And it's easy to do because this tool, it's only 30 items. You rate each of them from 1 to 6. 1 is strongly disagree, 6 is strongly agree. And each of the items, they are part of one of 6 factors that together provide comprehensive information about a person's preferences for and reactions to giving, receiving, and clarifying corrective feedback. And the questions fall into 3 clusters, like I just mentioned: the giving feedback, clarifying feedback, and receiving it. And then the item example, so some examples of it. So like the receiving corrective feedback, an example of one of those items is, I feel criticized when I receive corrective feedback. An example of the clarifying corrective feedback: when I'm not sure about the corrective feedback message delivered to me, I do not ask for clarification. And then another example from the giving corrective feedback cluster is, verbalizing corrective feedback is awkward for me. And so I think this is a really good tool to kind of generate some like self-reflection. And I think, Marissa, if you're open to it, I would have fun with us kind of going through a couple of those questions and talking them out. How does that sound?
Yes, I love that. Let's do it.
Okay, so this first one here, so again, 1 is strongly disagree, 6 is strongly agree. And so this one here is, it is hard for me not to interpret corrective feedback as a criticism of my personal competence.
I don't have the number thing. We're sharing, right?
Yeah. I think for me, I would say slightly agree. That's a number 4, slightly agree.
Yes.
I do take it sometimes as a criticism of my personal competence, but I think that this is why, if you build that really strong relationship with your supervisor in the beginning, it's easier to not take it so personally, because you're realizing this person knows me, they know my skill set, and they just want to make me better.
Yes. Agree. I would also lean towards slightly agree, because like that's just where I'll go just naturally, I think. But yeah, really also, even if it's like in a space of maybe one that I'm not super secure in and I'm receiving feedback, I also know that if I pause and just take it in for, a few, that I'm going to be able to reflect on it and really piece it together of like, okay, there is some validity to it. Even if I don't believe it in the moment, or if I think it's, I'm not with it in the moment, I think that there is something I can take from it. So I've really learned that pause for me, sometimes I go right in, right? Of like, maybe, yeah, being a little more defensive. So definitely, I would definitely say slightly agree.
Yeah. Another one is giving written corrective feedback is easier for me to do than speaking directly to the person.
I'm going to say slightly disagree.
Yeah, I would say disagree. And I think this is just based on people's like communication styles, right? And so like for me, I think I prefer to just speak to somebody face to face. But there might be other people who don't realize like, oh, I am more comfortable giving written feedback. And so I think this is an interesting question, something I never would have thought of honestly without this tool.
Yeah. And it also, I think written, it depends on the situation, because sometimes I think what I get nervous about is how it's received, how it's going to be received on, like if I'm the person writing it, how my words will be received. So that to me is like, it'll kind of keep me from doing that written portion maybe. And like you said, prefer having a more of a dialogue about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one last one we can do is I worry too much about upsetting others when I have to give corrective feedback.
I would say slightly disagree.
I think for me, I would go between slightly disagree and slightly agree. I think it would just depend on the person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, do you want to share more about your thoughts?
I think that I do put a lot of effort into like the pre-planning portion that we kind of talked about. So, I think that, yeah, I think that I think a lot about it beforehand. And so I guess maybe that is worry, but yeah, I think I'm more like a practical, and I'm kind of analyzing the pieces and like kind of compartmentalizing like, okay, no, this is valid. This might be perceived in a certain way. So let me prepare to, kind of address that. So yeah, that one's a little harder. It's a little more complex.
Yeah, I think you and I are at such different journeys in our of being a BCBA. You've been a BCBA for a while. I just became a BCBA earlier this year. I'm not directly supervising anybody at this time. I do plan on starting supervising people next year, but I think I'm definitely in a place right now of like, I think I'd be still, I feel like it's maybe a little too much of a baby BCBA to providing people, to upsetting people and providing feedback. And so that is something I hope to get better on before I start like taking on my own like mentees next year. And so I'm sure that's like something that comes with time and skill and everything. And you've definitely had the experience, like you've mentioned, of like pre-planning. And so like you probably feel very confident and like, I know how to like set up a good relationship and like hopefully create an environment to create to foster this like feedback.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you'd be a great supervisor, Jen. I'm glad, and there's that criteria now, right? Like you have to technically wait 1 year to supervise, but I really like that quote unquote rule that has been newly implemented, because I think it does give you some time to adjust, but also, your LMFT background is going to be a huge strength. So I think it'll be great. And one thing I love about even just Joyscape is like I mentioned for myself, is I've made a lot of mistakes as a supervisor, and a lot of things that maybe wouldn't call them mistakes, but a lot of things that I can learn from. And I'm a different person than I was 5 years ago when I first became a BCBA, and I'm proud of that. But in the moment, did it feel good? Not at all. Or when I would reflect back and be like, oh man, I could have delivered that feedback a little bit differently, but I didn't quite have the tool set. So those things take time too, but I think that everyone's journey is different, but I'm glad to hear, and even knowing and hearing your knowledge on, these soft skills and how to implement them within feedback and in a supervision relationship, I think you're gonna do awesome. So, it is all a learning experience, and the more you get under your belt, and then time will really teach you a lot too. But you already have a lot of the experience, so I think it's going to be great to have your insight.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, I definitely look forward to it.
Great. Did you have any last notes before we sign off?
I don't think so. I think we covered so much ground today, and I know that we were kind of talking about this before I even recorded this podcast. We could probably teach a semester's long course on these types of things. But I think, like you said, our field is changing a little bit, especially when it comes to supervision or this idea of more compassionate care. And I think that the way that needle gets moved forward is by people having these conversations, and is by us bringing up these topics and like disseminating this information. And even if we haven't covered on every single topic today, like I really do hope that this podcast episode empowers people to like do their own Google search of the almighty Google, like we were talking about earlier, of, how can I embed more compassionate care in my supervisor relationships, in my relationships with caregivers and with other support specialists. And so, that's really just like my hope of recording this podcast today.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen, for, also being a repeat guest. It's always so fun to have you on and just hear the knowledge that you bring and the different perspectives from different disciplines. I think that's huge. And it's really great to have someone like you, also in our discipline of ABA, to really get that broad perspective, because that is, like you mentioned, where we're kind of moving towards, and having, just more compassion on a day-to-day, and how we, help the future also facilitate that, right? We are the future. but thank you so much, Jen. This has been a really great episode, and I hope our audience takes advantage of it. And if you enjoy it, please don't forget to follow us on our social media accounts at Joyscape Therapy. Give this podcast episode a like, a review, and we'll catch you next time. Signing out.